Welcome back to Holiness to the Lord. Did you know I've spoken in General Conference?
I remember
ข้าพ
vividly
เจ้ายังจือตอนยังน้อยได้ดีมื้อหนึงตอนข้าพเจ้ากำลังเล่นกับหมู่อยู่ข้าพเจ้าได้เฮ็ดบ้องยิ้มของห่านที่อยู่ใกล้บ้านแตกโดยบังเอิญเมื่อบ้องยิ้มแตกข้าพเจ้าก็หย่านจนตาพดเพราะคิดว่าตนเองต้องเข้าคุกตลอดชีวิตนับแต่วันนี้ไป
Now granted, it wasn't from the pulpit and it wasn't in English, also they weren't my words to say, but it still counts, right? Anyway, I've previously had the chance to work behind the scenes for translating for General Conference, so I wanted to document what it was like. But because this is the internet, I'm going to blur everyone's faces out and stick to a new face over mine, mostly because I'm not in contact with a lot of these people, so a one-size-fits-all approach seems prudent, as I'd have to blur out faces anyway. First, a little backstory on the language I helped with. When I got my mission call, it was to the Sacramento, California mission, speaking Laotian, or as I famously incorrectly pronounced, Laotain. In my defense, it is spelled funny. So let's go through a little history, as that will explain more about my translation experience. Laos is this southeastern Asian country, right around Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. It was part of the area that was well known back in the day as Siam, and much like is shown in The King and I, education hasn't necessarily been the country's strong suit, so literacy is lower there than in developed countries. Because it was so close to Vietnam, when communism and the Vietnam War broke out, Laos actually played a pretty important role in the war. Both its people, as well as the Hmongs, and because of the geographical access to Vietnam. Now, while I'm happy to say communism didn't take over the entire region, the atrocities infamous in Cambodia also happened to a smaller scale in Laos. There are many people who were brutally abused and killed, and many more who were forced to flee or faced similarly brutal fates. So, many of the refugees from that region came over to the US, and one of the most concentrated areas of Laotian populations has been Sacramento, California. Hence why I got called there. So when I got called, there wasn't yet a full translation of the Book of Mormon into Lao. On the left you see a picture that's a bigger book that is selections from the Book of Mormon. When there's enough members who speak a language, that's when the church officially translates selections from the Book of Mormon and some resources into that language. Then when the amount of members gets above another threshold, that's when the church commissions an entire translation. The book on the right here is the full Thai Book of Mormon. Thai and Lao are comparable to how I've heard Spanish and Portuguese are closely related languages. There's a lot of crossover. So between Laos being a communist country that bars the preaching of religion, and a close enough language for many purposes, the fully translated Book of Mormon didn't become available until I was in the MTC, which is pretty cool. So how does this relate to my translation? Because the general lack of literacy within the Lao population, and the fairly small community of missionaries who spoke Lao, when I got home from my mission, I got in contact with those who helped translate for General Conference, and I volunteered to help. Now, for the people who are actually good at translating, the church employs them and their abilities to do lots of translation work. In my case, however, I was just a volunteer, and mostly was just a reader at that. So for the Lao team at that time, the head translator would get the talks in English a couple of weeks before conference, and she would do the work of actually translating the talk. She then would send me this, a side-by-side of the English talk and the translation. With it would come general info, like which session and which speaker number this talk was going to be in the session. And they'd also have the time allotted for the speaker as well as other pertinent information like that. Now what did I, the amateur non-native speaker, do to prepare once I had this? Well, first I'd go through and I'd read the talk in English several times. Then, because Lao Church vocabulary is usually more verbose than the English version, and also because I was never as fast a reader in Lao as I am in English, I had to practice some shortcuts. You'll notice that the notation I used in this process involves scribbling out any references I wasn't to read aloud, as well as putting red parentheses around certain portions of what was said. These red parentheses showed what I deemed to be non-essential parts of the talk, parts that could be skipped orally if needed. Some people on the team would just read straight through, and if they didn't get to finish by the time the actual speaker finished, they would just end their language version early. Personally, because I knew that eventually everyone who wanted it could get the full written version, and that there'd be many who couldn't read said written version, I opted for pre-preparing shortcuts when I fell behind. Thus, hopefully, I'd be able to get across the crux of the message each time, even if I wasn't able to get it all in. Then I would practice. I'd read the Lao version while timing myself, and would take said shortcuts and potentially identify new shortcuts until I could read the whole talk smoothly in the allotted time. So once I prepared, how did the day of translation work actually happen? Well, we'd show up and park in the garage underneath the conference center, and then we'd enter a particular entrance that, if memory serves, would put us right about here, this section between the lower and upper seating in the conference center. The area was long and thin, and there were rows of little sound booths, enough for 2 people to sit in, one booth for each language. We'd start each session with a devotional, and then we would man the booths. General Conference would be playing in English in the main area, and then each booth at any given time had the person speaking and the person who was next up. Within the booth, there was an English feed of conference, and each person had a headset, and the person who wasn't actively speaking would be following along over the other person's shoulder, just in case there was a mix-up or they got lost or something like that. While most of the talks are given word for word, when people would go off script is usually just the first couple of sentences. Any pre-planned revisions would come through and be placed on the desks outside of each booth. Maybe it's just because I was a volunteer, but if memory serves correctly, things like names of new apostles and places of new temples and the like were handled by the official and more senior translators, but even they were given very short notice on such things. If I remember correctly, for new apostles, they would send back the short talk to be translated when they would give their short talk, but it wouldn't have their names on there, just the speaker number for the session. Anyway, people would rotate out between the booth, and generally there'd be one person per talk per session, at least in the Lao area. You could cover several talks in the weekend, but they would try to space them out so you'd only have one, maybe two in a given session. And between sessions, we would walk outside and go through the church office building to be fed, and then we'd go back down and get ready for the next session. That's really all there is to it. Now, take all this with a grain of salt, as this is all from an unofficial perspective of a volunteer translator on one of the smaller translation teams, trying to remember details from several years ago. But I kind of want to put this together to explain some of the behind-the-scenes magic that goes on to make General Conference available to so many people around the world in their native languages. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.